3 weeks before my parents signed the house over to me, like they'd promised my entire life, I found out they'd actually been preparing it for a half-sister I never knew existed. And by the time I understood what was actually happening, I realized I hadn't been waiting to inherit my childhood home. I had been waiting to watch someone else move into it. My name is Casey, and this is the story of the most elaborate family deception I've ever lived through. One that took 10 years to build and 11 days to completely unravel, and one I only survived because of a single misdelivered piece of mail that was never supposed to reach me at all. My parents bought our family home 31 years ago, the same year I was born, and for as long as I can remember, they had always talked about it eventually being mine, the kind of gentle, repeated promise that felt, for most of my life, uncomplicated in the best possible way. I'm an only child. There was never any question, in my understanding, of who would eventually inherit it. My father told me directly, at a dinner I still remember in exact detail roughly 10 months ago, that he and my mother had finally decided to formally transfer the deed to me the following spring, once some remaining paperwork with their estate attorney was finalized. I want to explain, before I get into how this all fell apart, that my mother's relationship with her own sister, my Aunt Marlene, had always struck me as slightly strained. Though for most of my life, I attributed that to ordinary sibling distance rather than anything more concerning. Marlene lived 2 states away, visited rarely, and the two of them spoke on the phone with a kind of careful, clipped politeness that occasionally grated on me, but never seemed sinister. Just 2 sisters who'd simply drifted, the kind plenty of families navigate without it meaning anything deeper was wrong. What I didn't fully understand until 3 weeks before my parents were scheduled to sign the deed over to me was that 11 years ago, my mother discovered that my father had fathered a daughter during a period, decades earlier, before they were even married, a daughter named Olivia he had never told my mother about, and had, for reasons I'm still working to fully understand, quietly maintained contact with and financially supported for years without either my mother or me knowing she existed. I want to try to describe the vertigo of learning this in fragments, because that's genuinely how it happened. The house, in hindsight, contained warning signs I dismissed at the time as simply my parents being sentimental about renovations. My mother insisted on updating the guest suite above the garage roughly 2 years ago, a space I'd always assumed was simply for visitors, using a contractor she'd found through, she said, a family connection, a phrase I never once questioned. She began keeping certain paperwork in a locked drawer in the study, something I attributed at the time to ordinary financial privacy between parents and an adult child, never once suspecting the truth, that the drawer held a decade of correspondence, financial records, and eventually estate planning documents connected to a daughter my father had never told either of us about, until the exact circumstances I'm about to describe forced it into the open. The first genuine crack in this appeared 3 weeks before the scheduled deed transfer, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, when a piece of certified mail arrived at my own apartment, addressed correctly to my street number, but to a name that wasn't mine, Olivia Bennett. I called the sender's number listed on the return address, a local estate attorney's office, assuming a simple postal error. Hi, I think I received someone else's mail. I'm not Olivia Bennett. There was a pause on the receptionist's end that told me, before she even fully answered, that something significant was about to unravel. I'm so sorry, let me check on this. Can I call you back? I want to make sure I give you accurate information rather than guessing. That call back, when it finally came an hour later from the attorney himself, revealed something almost impossible for me to process even as he was actively explaining it. The firm had, for the past several months, been finalizing estate planning documents for my parents that included a formal, separate provision transferring partial ownership of our family home, the exact home I'd been promised my entire life, to Olivia Bennett, listed in the draft documents as my father's daughter. I want to try to describe the specific vertigo of learning that the house I had believed was simply, uncomplicatedly mine to eventually inherit had actually been the subject of ongoing, secret estate planning for a sibling I had never once heard mentioned in 31 years of life. It felt less like discovering an old family secret, and more like discovering that the entire structure of my expected inheritance had been, in some fundamental way, a kind of elaborate placeholder, real enough from my perspective, but apparently understood by my parents as something that would ultimately need to be shared, or possibly reconsidered altogether, with a person I didn't even know existed. I called my mother immediately after hanging up with the attorney. My hands were shaking so badly I had to try dialing twice. She didn't answer. I called 4 more times over the following hour before she finally called back, her voice carrying a strange, tight quality I had never heard from her before. Casey, hi. Sorry, I was out. What's going on? Mom, who is Olivia Bennett, and why is she named in an estate document about our house? The silence on the other end of that call stretched long enough that I genuinely wondered if the connection had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its earlier casualness entirely. "Casey, I need you to come over tonight. This isn't something I want to get into over the phone." I drove to my parents' house that same evening, refusing to wait even the additional hours it would have taken to schedule something more formal. What followed was one of the most disorienting conversations of my entire life, delivered in fragments over nearly 2 hours, as my mother slowly, painfully revealed a truth that had apparently been operating underneath our entire family without my knowledge. Roughly 11 years ago, my mother discovered, through an old friend, that my father had fathered a child, Olivia, during a relationship he'd had years before they married, one he had never previously disclosed. Rather than confronting this immediately and publicly, my mother made her own private decision. She would quietly allow my father to maintain contact with and support Olivia, on the condition that this remain entirely secret from me, and that any eventual estate provisions be handled through their attorney rather than ever becoming a topic of open family discussion. I didn't want to blow up your entire understanding of our family over something that happened before your father and I were even married, my mother told me, her voice thick with what sounded like genuine distress, though by that point I found myself unable to fully trust anything about the situation. I told myself I could just quietly make sure she was taken care of, that it wouldn't actually need to change anything for you. And somewhere along the way, that meant the house conversation kept getting more complicated instead of simpler. I want to be clear about something I've had to sit with extensively since this happened. I don't believe my mother set out to permanently deceive me. I think she was a genuinely conflict-averse person who lacked the resolve to have one very difficult conversation early on, and who let a decade of quiet, private accommodation build into something considerably larger and more consequential than she ever intended. This understanding doesn't excuse what happened. It simply helps me make sense of how something this significant could exist for over a decade without my mother, in her own telling, ever fully consciously deciding to keep it from me forever. I met Olivia exactly once, about a month after everything came apart, in a conversation I initiated mostly because I needed some form of closure. She was, it turned out, almost entirely unaware of the scale of secrecy involved. She had believed, for years, that I simply knew about her and that our families had quietly agreed not to be close. Not that my entire understanding of our family's history had been deliberately withheld from me. I confronted my father directly the following week. He didn't fully apologize, not in the way I needed. "I always told myself I'd tell you eventually, when the timing felt right," he said. "I know that's not good enough. I just kept telling myself there wasn't a good time, and eventually 10 years had passed." I want to describe what the actual day of the originally scheduled deed transfer felt like, because it's one of the more surreal experiences I've ever lived through. It didn't happen. The whole process was paused indefinitely while my parents, their attorney, and I worked through a completely revised estate plan, one built on honesty instead of a decade of careful, compartmentalized secrecy. It's been just over a year since everything happened. The house is, ultimately, still going to be mine, with a separate, transparent provision made for Olivia elsewhere in my parents' estate, an outcome we arrived at together, openly, rather than one built in a locked drawer over 10 years. If you've ever discovered that a promise you trusted completely was quietly running in parallel to something else you had no idea existed, I want to hear how you found out, and how you found your way through it afterward. I used to believe that 31 years of consistent, repeated promises were proof enough of a settled future. I've learned, in the hardest possible way, that even the people who love us most can carry a secret so long they forget how to put it down, and that sometimes the only thing that finally forces the truth into the open is one piece of mail that was never supposed to find its way to you at all.